Good evening. It's an honor to be with you, and Happy Nowruz to those who are celebrating. I'm Namiki Kohler, the director of the Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Thank you for joining us this evening to discuss ongoing mass atrocities against the Uyghur population and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, China, and what the world can do to halt these crimes. You've just heard the Uyghur folk song, Mother's Lullaby, performed by Muhtar Abdulkarim Janbaz and written by Abdurrahim Otkur and Abdurrahim Hayat. Uyghur music, as well as other expressions of Uyghur culture, have been under attack by the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP has intentionally been trying to destroy the Uyghur people through policies of mass detention, torture, transfer of children, forced labor, separation of men and women, and restrictions on reproductive capacity. These policies are backed by systems of mass surveillance. The US State Department has determined that the CCP's crimes amount to genocide and crimes against humanity. These crimes have impacted millions, in particular women, who have been overlooked in so many contexts of the victims as genocidal policies. The policies of the CCP pose new challenges to those of us who seek to halt ongoing mass atrocities and prevent such crimes in the future. The Chinese government continues to restrict the flow of information regarding what is happening to Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. But we know what is happening to the Uyghur community because of the brave efforts from Uyghur researchers and experts, many of whom are in the room right now, who are dedicated to bringing the truth to the world. We are honored to have you here with us this evening. As we're gathered here today, untold numbers of Uyghurs remain missing, either detained, imprisoned, or simply disappeared. We are grateful to be joined today by friends and colleagues in the Uyghur community. Everyone has a story of loss, a story of a friend or a loved one who's been detained or disappeared. We recognize the longstanding efforts of our Uyghur colleagues to bring an end to the CCP's crimes, and we look forward to hearing from our featured speakers tonight, who will discuss how the world can effectively halt these mass atrocities and provide a measure of justice to those who have been so severely harmed. It is now my honor to introduce Esther Starobin, a survivor of the Holocaust and a volunteer here at the museum.
Good evening. My name is Esther Starobin. I'm a Holocaust survivor and a museum volunteer. I was born in Adelsheim, Germany in 1937, just a few years after Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor. Adelsheim is a very small town with an even smaller Jewish community. Only 10 Jewish families lived in the area. My father, who had lost a leg in the First World War, established a business selling grain to farmers and arranging the trade of cows, etc. My mother, who was actually the owner of the business, assisted my father when she wasn't raising me and my 4 older children. This is my family. In February 1937, about 2 months after I was born, my father took a customer to court for an unpaid bill related to a cow. Through the museum's research efforts, I was able to review a copy of the court case. During the trial, the judge called my father Jew Rosenfeld, didn't even use his name. And of course, my parents lost the case. They had to pay for the cow and they lost their business. And then I was born. With the onset of various laws restricting the rights of Jews, one of which prohibited Jewish children from attending public school, so my 3 oldest sisters were sent to live with some aunts in Aachen, a couple of 100 miles away, so they could go to a Jewish school. My sisters didn't talk about it much. They did talk about people being in the house at night and they were gone in the morning, so they assumed my aunts were helping them escape from Nazi Germany. In March 1939, just a few months after Kristallnacht, the first major state-sponsored violent attack against Jews in Germany, my 3 sisters were sent to England on the Kindertransport. They were never able to say goodbye to our parents. For those of you unfamiliar with the Kindertransport, it was a rescue effort that brought thousands of refugee children, the vast majority of them Jewish, to Great Britain from Nazi Germany. Many faith-based organizations and child welfare organizations worked together to support these transports. I was sent on a Kindertransport when I was 2 years old. I'm not sure why I was sent and not my brother, who was 4 years older. I also don't know who looked after me. I was 2 years old when I arrived in England in June 1939. I was greeted by a woman from the Quaker Society who escorted me to Thorpe, where my foster family was waiting for me. My foster father worked in a shoe factory at that time and had responded to a flyer posted at the company stating the need for foster families for refugee children. Dorothy, Harry, and their son Alan were fundamentalist Christians who immediately welcomed me into their home. Despite the war and the persecution of Jews in Germany and other parts of Europe, I had a very happy childhood with the Harrisons, because I didn't remember my parents at all. On occasion, my sisters, who were living in different parts of England, came to visit. My parents and my brother, Herman, were deported to Gurs concentration camp in France in October 1940. Herman was taken from the camp by a Jewish group, OSE, and brought to the United States in 1941. He lived with an aunt and uncle who had immigrated earlier. My parents were sent from Gurs to Rivesaltes and then to Auschwitz in August 1942, where they were murdered. 14 other members of my family also lost their lives in the Holocaust. After the war, I was reunited with all my siblings in the United States. The adjustment of life in the United States was very difficult for me, but my older sisters ensured that I was taken care of and lived a full life despite our experiences. It was not always easy to speak about my experiences during the Holocaust, but it is more important now than ever that we survivors share our stories and teach about the dangers of unchecked anti-Semitism and hate. As I watch the world today, I see how relevant the history of the Holocaust is. We must improve the teaching of the Holocaust to prevent the world from repeating the same mistakes, since the world has clearly not learned these lessons yet. How sad it is that we cannot see people as people and not divide them by race or religion. We must also spread information about genocide and other mass atrocities being committed today. That is why it means so much to me to be able to be here tonight and to work with the museum Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide to bring awareness to the plight of the Uyghur people in China. Although the US government made a genocide determination in 2021, the Uyghur community is still being persecuted. Where is the international community? Where is the outcry from the public? The unfortunate reality is that there are many conflicts that capture the world's attention today, but we must make sure the genocide of the Uyghur people remains front and center. Too many children have been orphaned following their parents' detention. Too many families are unaware of the fate of their loved ones. I know firsthand how this feels. Despite the Chinese government's efforts to silence activists, we must continue this important work. No one should experience what I and my family did. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther, for your powerful remarks. I would like to introduce Representative Jim McGovern. who is co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and a member of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, a longtime supporter of the Uyghur people and a friend of the museum. Representative McGovern.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. And what an honor it is to follow Esther. Thank you for sharing your story. It's very powerful. And I want to also thank the Simon Scott Center for inviting me to join you tonight. It was an honor to share this platform with analysts and activists whose important work is keeping a spotlight on the plight of the Uyghur people and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, China. I've been asked to speak briefly, which is almost a possibility if you're a member of Congress, but to speak briefly about the latest developments in Congress's response to the grave human rights violations that the government of the People's Republic of China is committing against the Uyghurs and others, abuses that have been determined by the State Department to constitute crimes against humanity and genocide. You know, in essence, the PRC has systematically sought to transform the thought and behavior of Uyghurs and forcefully assimilate them into PRC society. The techniques used have included mass internment in re-education centers, forced labor, enforced sterilization, torture, and the misuse of counterterrorism laws. Those here tonight know very well what has happened and continues to happen. The good news is that Congress has played an important role in responding to these atrocities by authorizing trade tools and sanctions. Congress acted because many of the people in this country, many in the Uyghur community, including many in this audience, demanded that Congress do something. They felt that the United States government could play a role in not only calling attention, but maybe influencing China's behavior. On the trade side, I led the passage of legislation called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And as you know, the UFLPA creates a presumption that goods produced or manufactured in Xinjiang or by entities with ties to Xinjiang are made with forced labor, unless Customs and Border Patrol affirmatively determines otherwise. As a result of this rebuttable presumption, since June 2022, 30 entities have been prevented from importing goods into the United States that we have every reason to believe were made with forced labor. In addition to the UFLPA prohibitions, since October 2019, the Commerce Department has added approximately 70 companies and public security entities to the Bureau of Industry and Security and Entity List under the Export Administration regulations due to their connections to human rights abuses or repression in Xinjiang. Congress has also authorized sanctions programs that can be used to impose costs on those responsible for human rights abuses. The Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which Congress passed in 2020, specifically targets PRC officials for their actions against Uyghurs and other Muslim minority groups, often in Xinjiang, although it's only been used a few times. More often, PRC officials have been sanctioned under Global Magnitsky for their role in repressing Uyghurs. So Congress is continuing to consider additional legislation. In mid-February, the House overwhelmingly passed the Uyghur Policy Act, introduced by my colleague Young Kim. This bill would create a special coordinator for Uyghur issues in the State Department. It is now in the hands of the Senate. And I think that is an appropriate thing to do, given the enormity of the tragedy that is unfolding against the Uyghurs. So Congress has acted and continues to act in response to the terrible situation in Xinjiang. And important legislation has been passed in relatively little time. I would just make one point about the legislation that we passed. What I think is unique about it is it's not simply a condemnation or a demand of the Chinese government. It is stuff that we have control over. It is about the behavior of U.S. companies and U.S. investment firms. And it is influencing, it is overseeing their behavior and how they relate to the Xinjiang region. So it is actually something that we have some control over. and that we know has an impact in the eyes of the Chinese government. But look, a lot more needs to be done. And to begin with, there's plenty of room to improve implementation. And I've been encouraged by recent additions to the UFLPA entity list. And I know the law has served to strengthen CBP capacity to fight forced labor. But many more entities belong on the list. And we need to continue to demand that the administration move in that direction. And it's also pretty clear that existing sanctions authorities could be used more robustly. Second, given the enormity of abuses in Xinjiang, it makes sense, as I said before, to have this special coordinator. The Senate should take up young Kim's bill as soon as possible. Third, we need to respond in a more forceful way to the PRC's expanding use of transnational repression. A month ago, I led a hearing on this issue under the auspices of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Elfida Iltabir, president of the Uyghur American Association, vividly described the impact of TNR, transnational repression, on the Uyghur community. I co-lead 2 bills to address this problem. Excuse me, one, HR 3654, the Transnational Repression Policy Act, which would require an interagency strategy to address TNR at home and abroad, and HR 5905, the Stop Transnational Repression Act, introduced by Adam Schiff, which would address gaps in U.S. law that limits prosecution. I encourage you to include these bills among your legislative priorities. And I can imagine many other aspects of this human rights crisis that deserve attention from Congress. For example, documentation of violations, development of legal cases at the international level, memorializing victims, addressing the misuse of counterterrorism law against Uyghurs, and proposals on issues like these, I think, would be interesting to see. Let me just close with just one final kind of observation. Let me just say that the work that I have been privileged to do side by side with many of you has not been motivated by fear of China or wanting to confront China for the sake of confronting China. And quite frankly, it is not because China has a communist government. What has motivated me on this issue is the stories that I have heard from the Uyghur community, from the testimonies that we have gathered, and the fact that every country, whether it's China or Russia or the United States or any country in the world, we all have an obligation under international human rights law to act in a certain way and to not act in a certain way. This is about upholding a global standard, because people sometimes criticize me for saying, you're just bashing China for the sake of bashing China. No, that is not it at all. I hope that someday we can incentivize or persuade China to behave differently. I want a good relationship with everybody in the world. And so, and if there is movement, we will be the first to acknowledge that there is movement. If these issues are being addressed, then we will acknowledge that they're being addressed. But this is about upholding an international standard of human rights law. That is what is our guiding principle. We're not picking on China just because we have an adversarial relationship with them. We are highlighting this because they are violating their international obligations under international human rights law. And I think that, the other things that we need to think about in terms of our approach here is how we can better help people on the ground in Xinjiang, how we can improve the lives of people who are actually living in this horrific state right now. And I encourage everybody to think out of the box, and we are open to new ideas, but it's not just about kind of the legislation and big legislation and about going after companies, which we are doing, that are doing business there. But it's also, we have to figure out how better we can help the people on the ground, how better we can bring people, how we can help with people who are in third countries get their immigration status regularized, how we can do better in getting information to people and getting relief to people who are still stuck in China. So I say all this because I encourage you to think about this issue, not just in the ways we have been, but even in untraditional ways. We need to think about, carrots as well as sticks, and we need to figure out ways to help people. And so I'll just close by saying that I have done my best to be wind at your back for the last few years. I've had the pleasure of working in a bipartisan way with people like Congressman Chris Smith and Senator Marco Rubio and others. This has been a bipartisan effort. Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi has been incredibly helpful on this. But we will continue to be wind at your back. This is a tragedy that the whole world needs to pay attention to, and we are not going to stop until the human rights and the dignity of the Uyghur people is upheld and respected. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Representative McGovern, for the call to action and also just for your consistent effort to try to innovate on how Congress can play an important and constructive role in improving the lives of the Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims. I am heartened by the steps that you said have been taken since March 2020, when here you came and announced the introduction of the Uyghur Forced Labor Act. And I hope they continue to have momentum and the behavioral change that is so sought in regards to the actions of the CCP. It is an honor right now to be able to hear remarks from Senator Marco Rubio, member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Vice Chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and member of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Council. Elnagar Iltabir, professional staff member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and friend of the museum, will read a letter from the senator.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very excited to be here representing Senator Marco Rubio because this issue is very, very dear to my heart. Dear friends, I would like to thank the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for inviting me to speak today, and I regret not being able to attend in person. The Holocaust Memorial Museum was founded on a single mission: to preserve the memory of the Holocaust, so that we can prevent future genocides. That is why the museum must play a leading role in ensuring the world does not forget about China's ongoing genocide of Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim ethnic groups in the Uyghur region. Even as the Chinese Communist Party continues to lie to the world about its mass atrocities, the evidence of this genocide is present all around us. Hundreds of Uyghur Americans have loved ones imprisoned in the camps and are kept in the dark by the Chinese government about whether or not they are still alive. Goods from tomatoes and fruits in our stores, to the cotton in our clothes, to the polysilicon used to make solar panels, and components in our electric vehicles are produced with the forced labor of millions of innocent Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims that are still in camps, prisons, and factories across China. Uyghur intellectuals, religious scholars, and cultural icons that are the backbone of a society are still imprisoned. Uyghur women continue to suffer horrific crimes, from forced abortion and sterilization to sexual violence to separation from their children. Simply put, the CCP's brutal genocidal policies aim to wipe out not just current, but also the next generation of Uyghurs. Yet General Secretary Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders remain allowed to traverse the world like respectable statesmen, courting Western corporate leaders to invest in China. That is why it is important to continue to impose economic and reputational costs on the CCP for its mass atrocities. That is why I have worked hard in Congress to press for export restrictions, import limitations, and blocking sanctions to hold accountable those responsible for these atrocities. The Biden administration must fully implement my Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act to sanction Chinese officials and entities that are supporting or enabling the CCP's genocide, and my Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to stop forced labor-made goods from entering our country. I had the honor of authoring and shepherding these two bills into law, and they must be fully implemented in line with the congressional intent. Further, in my capacity as the Vice Chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, we established a new Intelligence Community Atrocities Coordinator in last year's Intel Authorization Act. This position is to increase collection, analysis, and intelligence support for government-wide efforts to hold China accountable for its egregious human rights abuses, including Uyghur genocide. We should take every opportunity to expose China's genocide and crimes against humanity so that the world can see what Xi Jinping is doing to a vulnerable population over whom he has full control. The treatment of the Uyghurs is a stark warning of what a world dominated by Beijing would look like if the CCP displaces the United States as the preeminent economic, military, and diplomatic power. I am thankful for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for doing its part and for holding events like this to expose China's genocide. I hope the museum can find even more opportunities to expose what China is concealing from the world. I also encourage the museum and other academic and nonprofit organizations to continue to document every single act of atrocity the CCP is committing in the Uyghur region. Xi Jinping and CCP officials must be held accountable for their crimes against humanity. Sincerely, Marco Rubio.
Thank you so much, Alnagar, and thank you, Senator Rubio, for those incredibly powerful remarks and the efforts that you've been taking. I would now like to introduce Deputy Assistant Secretary Mark Lambert, who is China Coordinator and Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs at the U.S. Department of State.
Good evening. Let me begin by thanking the museum and providing a personal note of thanks to the museum. A lot of people don't realize that when State Department officials reach the senior ranks, we take a special course. As part of that course, we come here. And we tour the museum with an eye on American diplomats. And I'm proud that American diplomats, oftentimes in the lead up to World War II, did the right thing. And there are plenty of cases of those. But all too often, we did not stand up to atrocities. We did not stand up to genocide. And this museum reminds me of that and reminds me of our duty as public servants to be there. I'm also struck by Congressman McGovern's remarks and his carrying the mantle of Tom Lantos. I was very fortunate 25 years ago as a young human rights officer in Beijing to assist Congressman Lantos several times and was struck by his manner as much as his courage of conviction. The man was a true scholar. He respected Chinese culture and Chinese traditions, and yet he spoke truth to power and asked the Chinese to live up to their best selves. So I think it's a real privilege to see that that tradition continues. I'm very humbled and honored to be here tonight. I've had a chance to work with some of you, and I look forward to working with more of you as we go forward. I've served in the United States Foreign Service for over 30 years now, working in embassies around the world, from Beijing to Bogota, from Bangkok to Baghdad. And as I mentioned, I was human rights officer in China 25 years ago, and I thought things were bad then, but they're a lot worse now. We need to be reminded, as Congressman McGovern mentioned, of we need to listen to you. I am a public servant. My colleagues are public servants. We work for you. We need to be reminded that we should always stand up for our interests and values and those of our allies and partners. We should be reminded that we must always speak out for human rights and fundamental freedoms. As President Biden often says, these values are in our DNA as Americans, and we must always continue to speak up for these values publicly and privately every chance we get. As I alluded to, we recognize that the PRC has become much more oppressive at home and much more aggressive abroad. This has certainly been true in Xinjiang, where Uyghurs, who are predominantly Muslim, and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups in that region continue to suffer genocide and crimes against humanity and other human rights violations and abuses. These include arbitrary arrest and detention, torture, forced sterilization, and persecution, including through forced labor, and the imposition of draconian restrictions on freedom of movement, of expression, and religion or belief. The UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a report in 2022 detailing many of these abuses, and the Commissioner recently pointed out that the PRC still has not addressed these concerns. I can assure you that the United States regularly raises concerns about atrocities and other human rights abuses and violations directly in our meetings with Chinese officials. As Secretary Blinken has said, Beijing insists that these are somehow internal matters and that others, including us, have no right to raise them. That is wrong. China's treatment of ethnic and religious minorities goes against the core tenets of the UN Charter itself and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that China signed and that all countries who are UN members are meant to adhere to. We will continue to raise these issues and call for change, not to stand against China, as Senator Rubio mentioned, but to stand up for peace, security, and human dignity. We will continue to work with our partners and our allies, including civil society groups and the private sector, to promote accountability for Chinese government ongoing genocide, crimes against humanity, and other human rights abuses, including those involving forced labor against Uyghurs and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. We need your help. I think at our best, we are nimble. We need to have public-private cooperation in order to come up with better ways of doing this and different issues that we need to raise. Due to the human rights concerns in Xinjiang, during this administration alone, we have designated 80 Chinese individuals and entities for some form of U.S. restrictive measure. On December 8th of last year, in commemoration of International Human Rights Day, the administration sanctioned 2 Chinese officials for their connection to ongoing serious human rights abuse in Xinjiang, and we issued a report to Congress pursuant to the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. In March 2021, the United States coordinated with the United Kingdom, Canada, and the European Union to impose coordinated sanctions on Chinese officials responsible for serious human rights abuses in Xinjiang. These were the first and the only joint sanctions on Chinese entities for human rights violations and abuses, and we are committed to do more with our international partners. We have institutionalized a new U.S. government and international focus on transnational repression to protect Uyghurs and other targeted communities from harassment outside of China, including issuing visa restrictions on Chinese officials involved in repression both inside of the PRC and abroad. We are also using a variety of tools, such as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, to prevent U.S. technology and capital from abetting human rights abuses and to prevent goods made with forced labor from entering the United States. As my colleague mentioned, reading Senator Rubio's letter, this is truly a bipartisan effort. And we support efforts to document human rights violations and abuses in order to hold those responsible accountable. In partnership with your community, from the Uyghur diaspora to members of Congress, we will continue to promote accountability for human rights abuses and violations through sanctions, visa restrictions, and other accountability tools as appropriate. Thank you again for your tireless efforts and dedication, and please do treat us as your public servants, because that is what we are. When you have ideas, tell us those ideas. Thank you.
I'd like to turn now to the conversation, and I'm very honored to be joined with our remarkable guests. Rian Tham is the senior lecturer on East Asian history at the University of Manchester and has been researching the Chinese government's policies against the Uyghur population. Motor Illiquid is the project researcher at the Uyghur Transitional Justice Database and has been painstakingly researching mass detention and related crimes. And Rahima Mahmood, the UK director for the World Uyghur Congress, who's been galvanizing international efforts to try to help protect the Uyghur community. We'd like to thank you for joining us all today. As the film noted, there are untold numbers of Uyghurs who are currently detained right now as we sit here. We're joined today by many Uyghurs who are still searching for their loved ones. I want to share with you just the experience of one such person. Bahram Sintash has been searching for his father since 2017. His father, Kurban Mahmood, is a well-known Uyghur journalist and was detained by the Chinese government a couple of months after returning home from a visit to his son here in the United States. He is serving 15 years in prison in northwestern China's Xinjiang region for political crimes. As we'll get into, the justifications given by the CCP vary, but really at the heart of it is the mere existence of the Uyghur people, their religious and ethnic identity. It's Ramadan right now. Observance of religious identity is grounds enough for people to be detained. One of the features, which I'm sure we'll get into, is the experiences of women, the efforts to inhibit their ability to have children. We'll talk more about that. But Rian, as the film noted, especially with COVID, it's been incredibly difficult to get information. And there was a lot of attention a few years ago on the plight of the Uyghurs, information that had been leaked. But as the film noted, there was, by the CCP, an announcement that they were going to close down some of these re-education facilities. You've been doing research on what has been happening in the last few years. Can you share with us a little bit about the current plight and what is happening to the Uyghur community?
Yeah, there is indeed a problem getting information on some policies, particularly on internment and imprisonment. Other policies continue to be talked about pretty openly in Chinese media and Chinese policy documents. So I guess I'll just run through a few of the main ones to give a sense, main policies to give a sense of what's changed and what hasn't. The re-education and internment camps are probably the policy that got the single most amount of attention outside of China, and the kind of I don't want to call it an overemphasis, but the extreme emphasis on, in particular, re-education has caused some uncertainty, I think. Internment and imprisonment involved three main kinds of institutions: the re-education internment camps, another kind of institution called a Kanshuosuo, which is a detention center that doesn't require criminal charges, and then prisons. And indeed, many of the re-education camps seem to have been closed, probably most of them. What's happened to the people in them, though, is less clear. Some percentage were released to community surveillance, to their homes. Others were transferred to forced labor, and then some other unknown proportion moved into prisons. And from publicly available information, it's really difficult to make any reliable estimates of those proportions. However, the other two institutions, the Kanshuosuos and the prisons, have left a lot of traces. There are continuing documentation that's released by the Chinese state about imprisonment. Those numbers are, since the campaign began, are now at about 600,000 people. And at the very same moment when they were claiming that people graduated from the re-education camps, we can see in that precise time period when they're decommissioning these camps, about just from publicly available satellite imagery, about a dozen prisons and kanchuosos expanding. Most recently, just in 2022, a new kanchuoso was built. So there's a bit of uncertainty about that, but it's clear that at least 500,000, the kanchuosos are not accounted for in any numbers, so could put it up to 1 million. It's hard to say, but there are still an enormous number of people in this kind of arbitrary internment. Other major policies like the transfer of children to Han care are expanding rapidly. Just in 2023, I've tracked down a dozen residential schools which are built to assimilate Uyghur children into Han culture. A dozen of those called for either building new schools or building additional dormitories. Just in 2023, one is being constructed as we speak. The prevention of births continues. While the state has eliminated local population numbers, they continue to release them for the province as a whole. And the expansion of the population through natural means of birth is hovering around 0 right now. And of course, forced labor continues to expand. Just, I think it was November, state media boasted that they had transferred, which is their euphemism, 3 million farmers into industrial work. And though that, along with sending your children to the boarding schools, these are not voluntary policies.
So Ryan, then, the CCP is making an argument that they have ameliorated the conditions for the Uyghur community. They have ended the re-education camps. So what you're saying is actually the people who are being detained, there's a very high probability that they're actually now being sent to other forms of detention, to prisons. And when we talk about, as you said, the coercive measures to forcibly prevent birth, we continue then to see no growth in the numbers of Uyghur women having children. So one would assume then that the forcible implantation of IUDs and other measures continue. So a lot of these policies that led to the US finding of genocide and the commission of crimes against humanity persist today. But what we don't see is the same amount of international focus, attention, and also then some of the information coming out, which makes your work, and then which are also your work, so incredibly difficult. You work on trying to document the experiences of those who have been detained. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about both the challenges that you face in doing that, and just to give context for those that are in the room, it is very difficult, as you said, Ryan, to think about the actual numbers, but when we released our report in March of 2020, we cited that between 1 and 3 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims had been in some form of detention. And when we put that in the context of the broader population, it's an astounding number of people who have unfortunately been targeted purely on the basis of their identity. So if you could share just a little bit about some of the work and the challenges that you've been doing.
Yes, I think in terms of the challenges, first of all, we see that the Uyghur community themselves, but before that, I should explain that the majority of our data are sourced from the diaspora community. It's either survivors of the camps that testify about their experiences, or family members of the victims of arbitrary detention or enforced disappearances that comes to us, or either we go and travel to different diaspora populated countries to conduct interviews and take the testimonies. When doing this, we find that the biggest challenge has been Uyghurs, majority of Uyghurs themselves, they struggle with finding out information, some basic information about the disappeared, about their detained family members, like their whereabouts, when they were taken, why they were taken, and their current status. So, and this is primarily due to the restrictions on communication imposed by the government, and most of the people in the diaspora who lost their family members, they find out about the detention status of their families months or years later because they're simply unable to communicate with them or contact them. So this lack of information has been a major obstacle. It made it difficult for us to meet the standards that we want to meet in our overall documentation effort. And secondly, we do also work with satellite imagery research. I think in terms of this field, we observe that the major issue here is the prevalence of false information that's available on Chinese websites. So when you are doing satellite imagery research, you normally compare different map services, and the difficulties here has been the verification work, because like, for example, when we clearly find a prison light compound on Google Maps in the middle of desert, and we go to Chinese map services like Baidu or Tencent Map to verify this information, you see that this area is just blank. And this adds up layers of complexity in the verification work. Then you will have to dig even more into it and try to find supplementary data to support your initial finding. So that's been quite challenging for our satellite researchers. And I think transnational repression has also played a role. Because like in the recent years, we do observe that there's this growing increasing fear in the diaspora community, and this results in people, starting to disengage with organizations like ours, or honestly also any other Uyghur diaspora organizations that works with advocating for the Uyghurs' rights. So it has been difficult to convince people to testify and to engage with us. I would say that's a major challenge. And in terms of challenges faced by our researchers, cybersecurity attacks is just something really common. Time to times, we would receive those notifications on our devices that says that some people are trying to log into your Signal, to your Telegram, Facebook, X, from different IP addresses. And then my Gmail account, my Google normally sends me those warning, and it says that your account is exposed to government-backed attack, and this happens to less than 0.00001% of the Google users. And then they would recommend me this all sorts of encrypted like physical codes that I have to use to log in, and you will just have to adapt to it. And then besides that, I think like attacks on social media, disinformation, counter-narrative campaigns, and all of those do pose a challenge and obstacles for our researchers. And to mitigate those risks, some of our researchers do maintain a very strict sense of anonymity. And we have a book that's expected to be released very soon in a few months, and both of the main authors works anonymously. I think their biggest concern is a potential identity leak and what this may cause to their family members back home. And personally, I think I've been very lucky in terms of this, because I grew up in the diaspora. I grew up in a safe country, having my families around me. But this do also come with a sense of responsibility, because I do see this as a moral obligation to be in this fight, given the privileges that I have compared to millions of other Uyghurs who are still suffering under Chinese dictatorship.
You mentioned about all of the threats that you face and that people are scared to come forward. And they're scared to come forward because if they speak publicly, there is a very high chance that their family members will then be arrested and detained and disappeared. In terms of getting other forms of information out, Ryan, you have been drawing on an array of sources. Do you mind just sharing a little bit about where you've been looking for the more recent information?
Yeah, if it's not directly about internment or imprisonment, the data is usually pretty robust. Actually, they've kind of half closed the spigot on procurement documents, which are the public calls for companies to bid to say build a new residential school or a new prison or something like that. But they're still out there, and that's what I've relied on for understanding the continued expansion of the residential schools. Policy documents still get put out. A lot of the speeches that set policy are much easier for us to understand now, thanks to the leaks over the last few years, where we can see the sort of fuller versions and see how these things are working. State media reports. I mean, local officials really want to boast that they are fulfilling the policy directives that come from above. And they do that either through local media or through their own social media accounts. And so we get a lot of numbers actually from these local things. And then of course people are living in these systems. So, you know, you have students in the residential schools posting pictures of their schools on their social media. And so you can kind of coordinate the satellite imagery and cross-reference it with the images from within the schools. And then that's all data coming from inside China. But we also have witnesses and survivors who've escaped by one means or another. The Xinjiang Victims Database now has, I think, over 10,000 cases of disappeared people whose family have testified about them. And of course, satellite imagery, which is really useful for the institutions that rely on large buildings. So there, I mean, there's an enormous amount out there.
So despite all the efforts to try to downplay the crimes that they are committing and trying to hide it, the fact is there is quite a lot of information. A lot of that information also is found by really courageous, as you said, Uyghur organizations and individuals. And Rahima, I wanted to talk to you and turn to you a little bit to talk about some of the work that Uyghur organizations have been doing to try to not just raise awareness of what's been happening in your community, but also call for specific actions and what some of those priorities are that you have and you're asking of the international community.
Thank you. And first of all, I'm very honored, I feel very honored to be here today. And also, I would like to take this opportunity to say Nowruz Mubarak to all my Uyghur friends and fellow Uyghurs who are here, present here. Normally, it's a day we perform and celebrate, but this year, because of Ramadan, no celebrations, but this event itself, I think it is extremely important. I flew all the way from London. The work that I focus on is actually UK. I'm the UK director. And the World Uyghur Congress, we have an international team that they responsible for EU and the UN level and many other countries. So for advocacy, number one thing is tell the world, make sure that the normal citizens understand what is happening, and find people who can multiply your voices. That's journalists. So a lot of my work is with working with BBC, ITV, many other big outlets, helping with documentaries, and also writing op-eds. So that's the number one thing that we make sure that as many people as possible to know what is going on, what's happening, and especially also encourage survivors to come forward. I remember working with the BBC on that. It's very hard to even talk about it now, about the mass rape case. And I remember Tusnai Ziauddin, even the last minute before the news was going to release, she was hesitating whether, she should withdraw. So those are very difficult work for us. We are like a frontline activists, and we also live our own horror. There's so much sadness in our life, but that doesn't stop us from laughing and smiling and singing and dancing, because we have to make sure that, first of all, mentally we are capable. So this is extremely important as well. And the second stage is to how we can reach out to the top level. So what is a way that we can make sure that government take actions? That is a parliament level. In UK, it's a parliament. So I worked very strategically building up a team of advisors, cross-party, cross-community. So advisors from Conservative, advisors from Labour Party, they can give me information about the MPs, about who are the most important persons to reach out to. And so this is like a whole new lesson for me. My background is petrochemical engineering, and I worked as an interpreter, translator, and I'm a singer. And then I found myself being an advocate. And like in every job, you need, if you want to do your job properly, you need to learn, and you need to know your roadmap. So that is whole thing. So in UK, what we did was to first think how we can make sure the government can recognize these crimes. So the UK Parliament in 2021 declared it is genocide. And then we also set up the Uyghur Tribunal, independent Uyghur Tribunal, led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, KC. I worked as an interpreter for China Tribunal. It was a similar court, but it was mainly to look at the organ harvesting, about the Falun Gong. And that's how I met these very important people. And World Uyghur Congress with the made extreme effort to, it wasn't an easy job, but we managed to set up that independent tribunal. Finally, the court, having examined the largest available evidence, in the end, a declaration was it is genocide, without reasonable doubt it's a genocide. So this itself empowered our campaign, our advocacy work, because it's so important to have this kind of legal recognition. So now, despite having this verdict, sadly, most of the governments refusing to acknowledge or accept. As we know, the US is the only government that recognizes this as genocide. So our prime focus is how we can make sure that UK government and other governments to recognize this genocide first step, and fulfill their obligations under the Genocide Convention, and a whole lots of like forced labor legislation and others.
I mean, it's pretty remarkable what you've been able to achieve just in terms of setting the record and also finding creative ways. The People's Tribunal is literally an effort that's been led by Uyghur organizations, experts from around the world, to try to both document and then tell the experience, and then do essentially a de facto legal determination of the crimes to try to compel the UK government, but hopefully other governments as well, to make a similar finding. Once you get a finding, though, as we unfortunately all too often know, we don't always see policy change or change sufficiently enough to really try to help ameliorate and prevent the ongoing crimes going on. So I want to move just a little bit to each of your reflections on what needs to be done right now. We heard very strong statements from the State Department, from members of Congress on efforts that have been taken here in the United States. And I was wondering if you could each just reflect a little bit on, given the urgency of the situation today, what is needed? And maybe, Mutra, I'll start just with you. If you don't mind also adding, you talked a lot about the risks that individuals face coming forward, the fear people have in even sharing their experiences with you. What more can be done to help protect those individuals from this transnational repression?
Yes, I think the United States has been taking the lead in addressing this issue of transnational repression. And then I think a few years ago there was this report that was published by Freedom House that described the extent of the issue and how China conducts the most sophisticated, global, and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression. And I think from the diaspora's experiences, people are being targeted in multiple ways, and the most typical one and serious one has been agents that's that's contacting members of the diaspora from the National Security Bureau and forcing people to spy on the community. And this was, if anyone has been following the Uyghur Tribunal, there was this case of Halmat Rozahun, who's a witness based in Japan, and his testimony was about how he received a video call from his long-lost brother, and when he picked up the call, it was his brother with blue marks all over his body and his face, and accompanied with a Chinese individual who clearly introduced himself as an agent from the State Security Bureau. And Halmat Rozahun was forced to spy on the Japanese Uyghur Association, and he was very smart. He recorded the entire conversation, and this was delivered as an evidence to the tribunal. And there has also been other cases where these instances has turned to serious physical harms. I think the Uyghur audiences here might be familiar with the name Yusufcan in Turkey. Yusufcan also similarly, his wives and kids were taken in hostage, and he was sent to Turkey to spy on the Uyghur community in Turkey. And when he decided to go public about his coerced activities, he was shot in the street of Istanbul, and he's in coma until today. So in terms of what could be done, that's accountability. The person who shot him, the police globally, in many countries, there's nothing being done. There's no accountability being taken on those agents. There's not enough effort that's put in terms of investigations. And besides that, I think other issues that's experienced by especially activist community in the diaspora is online social media attacks by internet trolls. I do not have an evidence to suggest this, but there's a common sense in the diaspora that those internet trolls are paid by the Chinese government, and what they do is that they engage in counter narratives, disinformation. And this leads to reputational damage, mental harm, mental distress, and this is just like every activist has to experience this at some point in their career. And for some other people like Rushan Abbas, for example, this is something that she has to deal with every day. And there's no accountability taken by social media companies, social media platforms. When you report those individuals, their accounts are not even being blocked, and you just have to wake up and deal with those hate messages and death threats and harassments every single day. And in terms of what could be done, this is something that could be prevented, and should be prevented. And then I think another serious issue faced by Uyghur community is coercive deportation in countries like, especially in countries in the Middle East, in Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. And the tactics here is usually China coercing or pressuring countries to extradite Uyghurs. And I remember, I think in 2015 alone, there were 109 Uyghurs being deported back to China from Thailand, and 13 Uyghur students were being deported back to China in Egypt the same year. And similar cases were also found in Turkey and Saudi Arabia and a number of other countries like Tajikistan. And I think what's most striking here is sometimes the involvement of Interpol in issuing some of these arrests. There was this case a few years ago. There was this Uyghur rights activist, Idris Hassan, who's based in Turkey. He is a software engineer. He and his family have been living in Turkey since 2012. And Turkey is home to the largest Uyghur diaspora population because of the linguistic and cultural similarities that we share with Turkic people. But in the recent years, as the bond between Ankara and Beijing is getting tighter and tighter following this big deal of investments through the Belt and Road Initiative, Uyghurs in Turkey has also become a very easy target for transnational repression. And in 2020, Erdogan signed an extradition treaty with the PRC that led to many Uyghurs trying to escape the country and make their ways to the West. And this was the case with Idris Hassan. And he landed at the Casablanca airport, and that's where he was arrested. Through an extensive set of campaigns and media coverage, Interpol decided eventually to withdraw the red notice, but there were no compensation, no comment on why it was withdrawn, and no public apology. And instead, his case just moved on under a bilateral extradition treaty between Morocco and the PRC. And Idris Hassan still remains in custody even until today. It's been more than 3 years. What does his destiny look like? We don't know. His legal team has been appealing to UN Committee Against Torture, citing universal principle on non-refoulement. But we do know about what could happen to him. And this is just a few single cases of the overall situation. And that with what I think is something that could have prevented.
Thank you so much for that. And you mentioned Rushan Abbas. Just wanted to note that Rushan is holding a picture of her sister, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, who's been detained by the Chinese government since September of 2018. She was tried and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Her conviction and her aunt's initial arrest were done in an attempt to silence Rushan and discourage her activism on behalf of the Uyghur community. Ryan, sorry, I wanted to turn to you and ask if you could share your perspectives on what more the U.S. government you think can be doing.
Well, that's a difficult one, particularly because the U.S. government has done more than any other government. I do think strong enforcement of the laws that have been passed is in order. I think we need. Maybe I'll just move a little bit outside the sort of U.S. government policy prescriptions and just say that I think we need a bit of a shift of attention away from the surveillance and the re-education camps, which have rightly garnered a lot of focus from people. But we still have an enormous number of people in prisons. We still have these children who are separated from their families, and these issues I think need more noise, more publication about them. And part of the reason for that is that the U.S. can't go it alone, and we need partners, particularly in the global South. And I think there needs to be some serious investment from activist organizations and governments in educational programs for the global South. There are a lot of members of governments in the global South that know exactly what's going on and continue to say it's not. And one of the things that permits that is that the Chinese state has really focused on those two issues of publicly available surveillance and the re-education camps, using them as ways to create a kind of cosmetic improvement in the region, so that they can bring officials, particularly again from the global South, on tours of the region. you can't see as a tourist or a journalist or a diplomat, you can't see all the children in the residential schools. You can't see all the people in the prisons. You can't see the lack of births. And so I think some greater attention and educational outreach efforts on the really comprehensive interlocking nature of these policies, I think would be in order.
Yeah, that's really great. We were talking before just about also the existence of such high surveillance and the use of technology to really oppress the Uyghur community, and how that is also something that's very difficult for anyone to see if they've been taken on one of these tours of a kind of almost Potemkin village. But I'm also very cognizant of the comments that you're making, Mutter, too, about just this transnational, the ties that China has, the ability to put pressure on countries through the Belt and Road Initiative to dissuade them from doing anything that may actually protect the Uyghur community. Different countries makes it very hard, as you say, to figure out how to forge the relationships, the Global South and elsewhere, that can actually help the Uyghur community. I wanted to just give the final word, Rahima, to you on some of the specific policy actions. You've noted the importance of having governments acknowledge and call the crimes by their name, but is there additional points that you are pushing and encouraging in terms of prescriptions for what you think can be done to help protect the community today?
Yeah, that's a very great question. I want to just add to what Ryan just said. I actually made a small list what I think that U.S. government should be doing. We're very grateful, and of course, U.S. been leading, leading role, but the actions not really impacting, especially people living there. And I think in order for this to be more effective, they need a coordinated approach with allies. So the sanctions, for example, the UK and EU only sanctioned 4 officials and left out like Chen Quanguo, who is the architect of this genocide. So these are the things that US can do, can really mobilize. And also, US can actually use its purchasing power to influence the procurement process of other countries with an aim to introduce similar legislation. So I had a meeting with, for example, the official in the embassy, US embassy, day before I came here, just also asking for this, how they can work more closely to encourage the UK to do the same. Also, as you know, the ICJ, from the UN level, we as Uyghurs who are living in this nightmare day in, day out, I have my own personal stories, and everyone here, they all have their own personal story. One is more horrible than the other. It's extremely painful. What we want is justice. We want to see that. Until we see the perpetrators brought to court and to be prosecuted, then there is no justice. So it is important, I think, that US government should support effort to bring the case to ICJ and address the roadblocks at the UN Security Council and preventing referrals. And lastly, I believe that United States is the member to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD. The Committee on CERD has said many times that it is concerned about what has happened to Uyghurs. Yet no country has been courageous enough to bring a complaint to that committee. So which has the power to investigate and rule against China. So making binding recommendations, the US could and should do this for us. I think these are maybe the quite high bar, but I believe that if they're willing, they can. Compared to many other countries, I believe US can do that.
Thank you. I think that's so critical. If they're willing, then they can. And I think the message for everyone here is that we each have a role to play in helping to mobilize that political will to act and to hold our elected officials around the world accountable in order to help protect the Uyghur community. In closing, I just wanted to highlight yet one more of our Uyghur partners. And again, just remind people of the humanity behind what we are here talking about. Often people have a hard time when we think about the Holocaust, thinking 6 million people. We referenced before, perhaps 600,000 in detention, up to 3 million people who have been detained within the Uyghur community. Each one of those people has a story, and a story that needs to be told. And I hope through the hard work that you're doing, one day their stories will be told and people will be held accountable for the crimes that were committed against them. And I'm very cognizant that there are many voices that unfortunately we do not hear because their experiences are just so traumatic and the threats facing them are so extreme, especially in the context of women who've been the victims of horrific sexual violence and other acts, that it makes it even more challenging for them to come forward. Mamatan Juma's brothers have been detained. Amat Jan, a teacher, was sentenced in 2017 to 14 years in prison. 2 of his other brothers were also arrested, detained, and have been released. Mamatan does not know where Amat Jan is, does not know whether or not he is healthy or is not, and does not know when or if he will be released. Again, the urgency of the situation is just so extreme and so dire, and I want to thank you all for being here today. I want to thank and honor our Uyghur colleagues who at great risk continue to do the hard work of trying to make the world listen, pay attention, and most of all act. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time and showing through your presence, your support for the Uyghur community, respect for the Uyghur community. For those who are celebrating Ramadan, I hope that you have, the time is now 7:43, so a good end to the fast. For those who I wish to happy Eid Mubarak, I'm sorry, I'm human and got the time totally wrong. But thank you to everyone that is here. I hope you have a good evening, and thank you again.